Dear Lord God, we come to you today. We are always thankful for your goodness in gathering us into your house each week to remind us of your ways and particularly of your gift of salvation that you give us through your Son, Jesus. Let us be refreshed while we're in your house this day. Bless also our discussion as we think about how it is that we can best honor you at the time of our death and can best give testimony to the things you have said about death and about the life to come. We ask this all in Christ's holy name. Amen. All right. So, a little bit of review. So today the kind of plan is that we'll be looking at the end of our discussion on cremation a little bit, and then we'll talk a little bit about embalming, and then we'll from there, we'll talk about, are there other options and what does that mean? And then we'll talk about just kind of trying to wrap up this portion and say, you know, kind of what are the general principles again with which we can operate when we make these decisions. So we talked, just as, again, a matter of review here, we talked about what happened when different people were, I guess I really didn't go back far enough. But first we talked about just God's people in general, how they were handled when they died. And most of them, I kind of use this phrase, carried and buried, right? They were cared for. The body was cared for in some way. A lot of times we're not even told about that. And then they were buried in some sort of grave, tomb, cave, all of the above, whatever. And so we saw kind of the consistency of that, and perhaps most consistently the fact that they're buried. And we also had that concept they were often buried with family members or fellow believers gathered to the fathers, and we talked about how that's been reflected in time by sort of family burial plots and things like that, or even family cemeteries, right? We mentioned, there are some exceptions like Joseph where he kind of well, I shouldn't say he necessarily, but the people taking care of him probably at his direction, since he was so important to embalm him. So then we said burial, two reasons. One, just this idea that we're returning to the dust, right? So that gives evidence of that. Then the other thing was just the idea of that we're being buried, then we're going to be raised. And so even, again, when you think about it, when we go out to place a person in the ground, our conversation is all about the fact that God is going to keep those remains until the day of the resurrection of all flesh, right? That we're not saying we're putting you out here and that's it. Rather, we're putting you here and God's going to come get you one day, right, when his Son returns. I think the other two we can skip for this. Then we just talked about, right, in the Bible that any kind of mention of someone being burned after death either had to deal with the question of a form of punishment or a form of purification. And also gross idolatry there at the end. So then we kind of summarized, right, that we can say these things, right? Well, there are things we can't say, right? But we can say there's no biblical tradition necessarily of this among God's people. Certainly not any consistent use of it. I guess I should, sometimes when I say that, then I think, well, I guess for the last 20 years or so, there has been a growing tradition of it among God's people, right? We can't discount ourselves completely from the overall, if we're looking at kind of what have Christians done, certainly we've had Christians doing this in recent years. The idea being that the dead body, if we get any word about what happened, to the body, it was cared for in some way, usually a pretty simple way. And then we also noted that, again, like I said, I wasn't really aware of this, but that especially in the early church, the Romans are practicing cremation consistently, and yet the Christians will not do that. And then we talked even about some of the martyrs and things that were burned to try to make the point that those Christians' belief in the resurrection was a bunch of hooey. I don't know if we used the word hooey last week. Probably not. And then we said, right, most Christians forbade the practice generally in their churches until 1960s, 1970s, and then now you find a lot of kind of talk of that it's not the preferred practice, but it's allowable. And why is that? Well, ultimately back to this, right, there is no explicit prohibition. There's no place where Jesus, an apostle or a prophet, says, God's people may not be burned, right? If you had that, we wouldn't have this Bible study, I think, right? So then we just talked about, how this has grown and grown in practice. And then we talked a little bit about the process and the sense of kind of how that all works. And again, that's one thing I don't think we really talked about, but this is always evolving somewhat. Now they have something called, what do they call it? No, I just lost the term. Aquamation, I think is what they call it, which is a chemical cremation where you get put in a tube and they put some chemicals that'll dissolve your body rather than burning it. And that's partially because some people have decided, even though we said, it was cost and this perceived environmental impact, we didn't talk about that a lot, but that was a big move when cremation was becoming popularized, was this idea that embalming was, and we haven't talked about that yet, but it was use toxic chemicals which might leach out into the ground, which might get into the groundwater, and so cremation was better. The problem is now, when they look at what comes out of a crematory, they say, well, there are some things that might be kind of I'm not saying this word right either. Carcinogenic. Did I say that right? I added an extra. Oh, I got it. All right. I thought I added an extra syllable in there. So now the cremation people are saying, well, that's not good either. So now they go to this aquamation, which again is not chemicals, but enzymes and things, which at least at this point are thought to be environmentally good. They may come out in 10 years and say, oh, we were wrong about that too. Those are toxic, but they're doing that. You can find all sorts of things, right? People saying that, you can kind of be turned into like fertilizers or, be planted under a tree so the tree will grow better, or all these different things. But we said cost and perceived environmental impact, and probably among most people, and maybe I shouldn't make this assumption, but I think like around here we would say cost is at least the one I hear the most about. Most people aren't saying, I want to be cremated because I'm concerned about contaminating the groundwater. Not that that's not a concern. Overall, we like clean water, everybody. Yeah. But, right, usually it's the cost thing. And we said that's, something always in flux, how much it costs and things like that. And I think, Dwayne, you said they said the cost would mostly be different just in terms of the burial process, right? The digging of the grave and
the casket.
Right, yeah.
So, there's some difference, but not as much as a person thinks.
Right, yeah. All right, so then we said, maybe this was the most interesting part, or the most, to me too, just like thinking about this idea that regardless of what we do, we should treat all human bodies the same. And so this is where we were talking about the, don't hand out an ear and a leg to somebody at your funeral, and if that's true, then don't hand out part of their ashes, and things like that. And all these other things about, there's the dividing it, scattering it, keeping it in your house, all these different things. Who was it that told me about the military? You, Doug, right? Oh, go ahead real quick. Tell me what you said.
Out in Boise, Idaho, they have a veteran cemetery where you can be buried, your ashes, or you can go to a section of the cemetery and just have your ashes spread.
Yeah, so there's kind of an open area for that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, and back to dividing. Mary, do you want to tell your story or not?
Well, I just shared a little, trying to be anonymous here,
Yeah.
about what we were talking about, and the person I shared it with said, oh, well, when my husband died, we went to the lake with all our friends, and they took part of his ashes and spread them, or they would take them to one of his favorite places, and the others said they wanted to take them home.
There you go. In paper cups, you said, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't even know if that, speaking of environmental impact, I don't think you want to breathe in ashes after they've been cremated. I think that would be a bad idea in general. Should I go to the medical table? What do you think? Breathing in human ash doesn't sound like a great idea?
The whole thing sounds very morbid.
All right.
I can't imagine that you do this, and I have a real thought. I'm like you. We divide them, and somebody gets the leg,
Yeah.
and somebody gets, the torso, and somebody gets, well, it just seems like we need to keep it all together.
Right.
Don't split your body.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's almost like, I mean, again, we do hear about this in history again. I mean, another form of punishment, right, throughout time has been this dismemberment, right, where they take somebody, cut them up into pieces, and send a part to each town to make sure everybody knew, or something like that. So, and again, we always want to be careful because we don't want people to dismiss thinking about this and going like, well, is that exactly the same? Well, we're not saying it's exactly the same, but it is part of how it helps us think about, right? And just, I think you put it well there. Let's just keep the body together in whatever, right, form it is. Let's honor it in that way.
What was the story in the Bible where a king or a prophet had divided a person up and put different parts of him throughout?
Oh, yeah. Oh, boy. Anybody else want to help out?
I don't remember.
Yeah. I remember. Yeah. I'm gonna have to look that up. But you're right. Yeah. It does happen biblically.
Whether it was an evil person or if somebody had gone against what the king decreed.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm gonna have to think on that one. You played Stump the Pastor, and you got me.
My mother-in-law told me a story or stories about working in surgery, and like an amputation, Catholic, they had to take it to the cemetery.
Oh, is that right?
Betty, do you know anything about that?
Well, sometimes. I think it depends on the religion.
Huh. Yeah.
And that was the same way if you had an ectopic pregnancy. Depended on the religion.
You just clip your nails.
All right. And then these are the two we just touched on again a little bit, but that I want to kind of finish this discussion out with, which is that, I'm starting here, I should say. There's one more screen, but it can certainly give the impression that the body does not matter after death. And again, just anecdotally talking to people about cremation, this seems to be a thing that comes up pretty often when you talk to people about cremation, is if you're talking to them for a while, they'll say, well, we don't need the body anymore anyways, or something along those lines, right? That, that person's gone, this isn't them, and all this kind of stuff, right? But to me, and again, that idea, I think, comes from, I think quite frankly, it comes from a lot of just in the maybe 80s and 90s, a lot of the television, we had some television shows that were kind of Christian, almost Christian, or, talked about angels or something like that. And a lot of those did a lot to this idea of just, at time of death, you'd see the soul go up out of the body, and that was it, right? But again, we always want to remember here that to be human fully is to be body and soul, right? It's not just to be soul, it's not just to be body, right? Adam's body is laying there in the Garden of Eden, right? And until the breath of life comes into it, then he's a living being, then he's a human, right? So we want to remember that. In the early church, there was a teaching that later was called Gnosticism, and Gnosticism just comes from the Greek word gnosis, which is the word we get our word knowledge from. You maybe kind of hear that, right? But it was an idea that there was kind of this secret knowledge that you had to learn that was more than just learning that Jesus had died for your sins and was going to give you eternal life. And what was that secret knowledge? I mean, they probably would have said there was more to it than this, but at the heart of it was the idea that the body was bad, that all creation was bad. And here we're not talking about, we would say like, right, all creation is fallen, broken because of sin, but they were saying in the Garden of Eden, quote unquote, right, it would have been, and I said quote unquote because they have a little different idea of how creation happened too, but they would say that the creation even itself in the beginning was sort of an act of someone, what they call a demagogue or what's the other word there? Yeah, we'll go with demagogue, that created this, but it was never really good. And so then the whole point of salvation becomes that you need to get rid of material things and only have spiritual things. And if you believe that, right, then death becomes this ultimate time when this occurs, that the soul goes up, this evil body's left behind, and that's what salvation really is not so much, I mean, although they would tie these ideas, but not so much about sin being taken away, but the body, matter being taken away. And again, I think I might have mentioned this a little bit, but how do we argue against that basic idea as Christians? Yes?
I believe it's Genesis 2, God said that, that everything he made was good.
Yeah. And humanity, very good.
Yeah.
Right. Well, you just answered my question. How do we argue against this?
Well,
there's point one, right?
You go to the Bible.
Yeah. How else? So, we would say, right, God created this matter. So if it's bad, he's creating bad stuff. There's one. What else?
The people were made in God's in the image of God.
Okay, so filling out that idea, he valued matter so much that he crafted the crown of his creation of matter, right, to be like him, to bear his image. What about with Jesus? How do you make the point from Jesus? Okay.
He was fully man as well.
Yeah, he was fully man. So in order to save us, he came down into the matter, took on our flesh, right? Then at the end of his life, we see this again because he was raised up bodily, right? Touch, feel my flesh, right? So again, if salvation is about just flying up soul alone to heaven, well, we should not have Easter Sunday, right? It should be Good Friday, and then we say, and then he went back to the Father. But no, he rose up bodily, ascended bodily, right? And again, I will admit the Bible doesn't talk a lot about this specifically, but I don't see any reason to not say he's not sitting at the right hand of the Father bodily. I think we would say that, right? It's part of who Jesus is now. So all of this, right, just goes against the basic tenets of the Bible. This flowed out of, right, which at the time, if you were, the Romans are around, but Greek philosophy is still a big deal, right? Greeks, those of you that like kind of world history, right, the Greeks were there before the Romans, and the Greeks followed Plato in his basic philosophy, and it was very much the same, that matter was bad and that spiritual things were good. I mean, if you ever studied Plato, he had all these ideas like, he talked about the real substance of something. So this, we call this a table, but this isn't table. Table is like an essence, and this is just some sort of thing that kind of helps remind us of that essence, right? Yeah, that's why you don't take philosophy classes. But so anyways, this was a very prevalent idea in the culture, and I think most people that have ever studied Gnosticism would say, right, they kind of took Christianity and Platonism and put them together, and they ended up with this thing called Gnosticism, which the church, time and time again said this is not the Christian faith, right? And so we have to be careful if we hear that in our day, this idea about the body really not being anything, just getting, and this is particularly, there's a temptation to this, particularly when someone's body goes through a lot of things before death, right? Because then you get this, I just want to be out of this body that hurts, that doesn't work. My eyes don't work, my ears don't work, maybe my brain, right, is not functioning. There's this idea of just getting rid of that. And again, we instead say, no, right? You're right that this is terrible, what your body's doing, and it's because of sin, right? Not like your particular sin giving you this particular malady, but just in general, this corruption that's in the world, right, is wearing down your body. But the good news is you're not going to have a body, but you're going to have a new perfected body raised up, right? He'll make our body to be like unto his glorious body. That's another thing we say at graveside, right? Okay. I cut you off before, Donnie.
Oh, you was talking about the military.
Yeah.
After Bible study last week, I said, okay, as we was learning here, people were burned in punishment.
Right.
But in the military, the old flags, what do you do with them when they're no longer? Well, you may, if you burn them like in a protest or something, that's bad.
Right.
If you burn them with the military, you still burn the flag, but you do it in a ceremonious, with respect.
Yeah. Right. And again, I do think, and again, this is where whenever we're talking about these things, we want to get to like the heart of what's going on, right, underneath, but we also don't want to like give the impression that we're accusing everyone that's ever been cremated that they just hate the body and hated their loved one or something, right? We don't want to give that impression. I think here, right, this is maybe by way of analogy, something we can say, right, is that probably we can say that, how do we put this, that cremation is much more practiced in our day like the burning of a flag. And really this is the same with Bibles. I mean, if you look up kind of how you're supposed to dispose of a Bible if, it's not usable, I mean, obviously try to give it away to somebody, all these other things first, but if it's just not usable, again, typically the answer is to burn, right, the Bible as well. And again, if someone was sitting out here out front today as you walked in with a Bible, right, on fire, you'd probably be pretty upset, right? But if I said at 3 o'clock today, bring on all your old Bibles and we're going to, take those, it would be with respect. So we do want to be honest here that when we're talking about cremation, it is often done in that kind of sense, right? It's not a super purposefully evil kind of thing, right? They're doing it with respect and with a ritual attached, which I think is part of what, with the flags again, right? There's kind of a way you do that, right? Yeah. All right. Also in our day, final thing, Eastern religions, yoga is tied in here a little bit. I mean, we won't go into all of yoga today, right? You can certainly stretch in yoga and there's nothing evil about it, but if you look at its basis, kind of where it came from and everything, it's all tied into Hinduism. And again, this is why, right, when, I don't know if they still show this as much, but I remember when I first saw yoga on TV, right, they were always going, Om, right, or something like that, right? That's a mantra, right? And the whole purpose of a mantra, again, is to clear your mind so that you can kind of just be spiritual instead of being weighed down by this body, right? So this is still a common idea. If you're around for all the, well, I shouldn't say were around, all the crystals, New Age stuff that was going around for a while and to me seems to be coming back in good measure again right now, they certainly would have this idea too. And so, look, I had the answers up here for you guys before when I asked how, right? So yeah, he created man, he took on human flesh, he rose bodily, and he promised the same for us. So yeah.
If you talk to somebody that's involved in the New Age, well, I get so much energy from that crystal. You know?
Right, yeah. And again, two things. One, wacky, right? That's my estimation. But number two, listen again, right? Energies, and then they do these weird things like crystals. Well, if you're all into energies and spiritual things, why are you going to a rock to get your energy? But, they seem to think like rocks are better than human beings, right? Like, or the body, the flesh, right? But yeah, it's certainly, again, a thing. You'll see that, I think, unfortunately, more and more. We're actually in, the good news is there's some indication in the statistics that people are actually returning to Orthodox Christianity, right? Not in large numbers, but that there's a starting to turn back to that. But the other religious kind of idea is they went from saying, I'm nothing, I don't know what I believe, right? And they're getting back into these kind of pagan practices of sitting in front of rocks, or, again, believing that an amulet of some form is what's, providing healing and different things like that, okay? And then this is kind of the final one is just, and I've said this in short matter several times, is that I'm just convinced that as a culture in general, we're trying to avoid death. That we don't want to think about it, we don't want to see it. And again, we all can say we know why, right? Is death fun? No, right? Maybe I should put it this way. Is dealing with someone who has died fun even, right? No, in the sense of all the things there that go on with that. Some of it just unavoidable things, especially in our culture, our system of all the things you got to take care of, right? All the people you got to contact. But here we're really just talking about beholding death. It's not fun. It's a grievous thing, right? It is us seeing the ultimate end of sin right before our face. And I'm just convinced that most things you see as cultural trends regarding end of life are all about this. And like I've said to some people, it's almost like people just disappear now, they don't die. All right? They're there, they've been at the nursing home for a while, and then, I'm not saying they still don't say they died, but then there's no service, there's no viewing, there's no anything, and people just kind of go on with their lives, right? And again, so I'm not saying they actually think they disappear, but I'm saying we try to come as close to that as possible. I'm not going to go see them when they're sick, right? And then, I'm not going to bring them, into my home, which used to be more common. And I understand there's been a big change as far as what you can do at your home versus what the medical establishments can do. And that's a real discussion you have to have at that time, right, about where the person might be, best off. But again, we do need to recognize it wasn't too long ago that most people died in their families' homes, right? Being cared for, right? Anybody grow up with a grandma in the house or a grandpa or not? 1, 2. So it's almost generationally here, even in the room a little bit, right? Where that kind of switched over. I wasn't calling you old, Dwayne.
You'd only be telling the truth.
Okay. But that certainly has changed. And so we just, again, then like I said, no services. I've talked to the funeral home directors, right? And they used to say, that being a funeral home director was one of the most stable, forms of employment because everyone was going to need your services at some point, right? But talk to the funeral home directors now and they say, well, that's not really, the one thing is they still got to be the guy to go pick up the body, right? But as far as the service and all of that, which just used to be assumed that they'd be involved in some way, right? It's not so true. In fact, I think that was in Minnesota, the guy told me, when they have their continuing education stuff now, that a large part of that is telling people the benefits of doing services, right? That they have to convince people that there is a good to doing services. And again, both because they actually believe that, but also just as a practical matter of sustaining their business, right? So I think everywhere we kind of see this, that we're trying to do this. And again, if we see someone doing this, again, we can start off by going, I get it. None of us wants to ponder this very long, but we need to. Because ultimately it shows us the effect of sin and death, and it leads us then to cry out, right, to God. That's why, right, the funeral sermon, right, is, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the service at the end of that, this whole thing. But that's why we want this direct presentation of sin and death and salvation and resurrection, right? Because people gathered at a funeral are generally speaking more open there to the idea of wanting something beyond life, right? And so we want to always make sure we give that to them. And again, even this idea of celebrating a person's life, right, can kind of go against this a little bit, right? Again, not to say we shouldn't celebrate people's lives at all, but if that's all we're doing, it's almost a matter, again, of hiding death, right? I mean, even if you think of a lot of funerals now, you come in and the body is either not there, or maybe it's in an urn somewhere, but you just have the pictures of the person's life. And again, I'm not saying don't put up pictures, don't be worried if you have a funeral that I was going to put up a poster board and now I think pastor won't allow that or doesn't think that's a good idea. But can you see what I'm saying? That even there at the funeral sometimes it's like we're only going to talk about this person's life before, and we're not going to talk about the fact that they died. Right? I don't even think, we don't have any psychologists in here, even psychologically I think that's just a bad idea, right? To not recognize what's really happened, right? It messes with the whole mourning process and all of that. Yeah.
Well, I think there's another thing about a funeral. It ought to have a gospel message, because you're going to have some people there that don't normally go to church.
Correct. Yeah.
A lot of people there probably don't normally go to church.
Yeah.
And they need to hear that gospel message.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you have people that are maybe more than likely, a little more likely at least to open up their ears and hear the message. And like you said, there's also people there that are not in church for any other reason, right? And again, there's another reason to continue having funerals, right? These community events that people will come to where they come into contact with the gospel, right? Again, if you're just going to go out and have a couple pints at the bar to remember someone, those same people will probably come, and they'll probably be more comfortable, right? But they might not get to hear the gospel.
Well, and if it affects one person, it's still very much worthwhile.
Absolutely, yeah.
You would not want, as a Christian, to have your funeral not be a witness to somebody and potentially change someone's life.
Yeah.
What a better... There's nothing
right.
I don't think your funeral could be. But.
Yeah, and I've kind of become more aware of this lately, but even to just this idea of, we have a lot more people, unfortunately now, right? They have kids and grandkids, right? People very dear to them that are no longer involved in the church at all. And they've tried throughout their life different ways, right? And I've kind of become more aware that a lot of the older people, they themselves understand, hey, I want my funeral to be one last shot at that, right? The last time I can kind of have some role again, right, of making sure my kids hear this message one more time, that this was what was really important to me, and even in death, that's what I think we should be talking about, right?
And I'm one of those persons.
Yeah.
And in fact, as I've talked to you about.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have some, Don?
This is maybe a little off of this subject.
Okay.
But when Christ died, did his body begin to deteriorate?
Well, in the grave, you mean?
Yeah.
It's the only two answers I think we can give to that is one, that he was fully human, right? And the second thing would be, now, we have the psalm that says, Psalm 16, I believe, right, that says, you did not leave my body to decay, but I think there, from everything I've ever studied with the Hebrew there, that would mean, again, you're not just leaving it there forever. I don't know, anyone else have thoughts on that? Again, I don't know that we have a specific, I guess my leaning would be to say, it was starting to, right? Yeah.
I mean, that,
What
Right.
else would they have done the
Spices and-
the oils on it because
Yeah.
it just started to sting?
Right. Yeah. Okay. All right. Oh, I forgot. We have all of embalming to go yet. Is that clock right? Yeah. Well, actually, I'm actually surprised how much time we have left today. I thought we were right at the end. I still got time. Here's the thing. Usually when we talk about cremation in our day, we'll usually, and this is something that's kind of just been new to me a little bit, but we usually will talk about, are you going to be cremated or are you going to have a traditional burial, right? Those are kind of the two options. Well, what does a traditional burial typically mean in our day? Again, if the funeral home director comes to you, he'll basically say, right, are we cremating, or I think traditional burial is the word they'd use. Anybody know for sure? But something along those lines. And again, if you say traditional burial, then they're going to say, okay, I need to have you sign this form so I can do the embalming, right? So it's almost the assumed practice, right? If you're not going to be cremated, you are going to be embalmed. Embalming is something that, you hear about this throughout history. We mentioned way back in Egypt, right, with Joseph. He was embalmed. Now again, in a much different fashion than what we do today as far as what was used in things, but this basic process. But then we can say it's kind of went up and down in popularity in different places, but it was during the Civil War that this became popular again in American history, mostly because people were dying in war and they were not near their home when they died. And so embalming kind of became a popularized practice so that you could preserve the body, have it look more like it did, at least, well, I shouldn't even say at the time of death. Generally, you look better. I don't know. This is always a thing. I know some people, right, will go to an open casket and go, people do look nice, and they think that, and other people think, I don't care what you do, they don't look that nice, right? But again, just this idea was to preserve the body so that you could have a funeral when you got back, and you could have an open casket funeral because that was, there's just standard practice, right? So that became popular, and then I think it was, I didn't write this down, maybe early 1900s to 1950 is when formaldehyde was kind of figured out to be used as an embalming fluid, and for whatever reason that made it a lot easier and standardized, and so it became more and more popular. I'm not going to say too much on this, but if you want to, go and Google on YouTube embalming, okay, or process of embalming. There's a guy on there now he'll take you through the whole process, but let's just say it's invasive in the sense of, you have to cut the body open, right, to get to the veins, to put the fluids in, right? You have to, they'll do what they call setting the face, right, which sometimes at least involves kind of putting plastic under the skin, right, to make it look better. They pump fluids into the organs, right, with a big long needle that you never would have wanted when you were alive, right? If Betty would have came in with that needle while you were still alive, you would have ran out of the hospital. And then there is this thing of the chemicals are really toxic, right? If you're an embalmer, when you go to do the embalming, you have to wear basically a hazmat suit with a respirator, right, on because of the toxicity of the chemicals, okay? So, well, let's get this next slide, right? What do we know about Christians and embalming. We don't really have a lot, but we do have this one Jewish historian, Flavius Josephus, right? If you've ever read any early church Jewish history or just anything about the early church world, a lot of what we know about that period comes from this guy, right? If some of you ever heard Paul Meyer, he was an LCMS Lutheran. He read all this guy, and this is where a lot of his material would come from. But he did write that Jews considered embalming a foreign and impious practice, right? So we know that it was around at that time in some manner, but that the Jews would not take part in it, which is likely to say again then that probably the early Christians would not have taken part in this too. And again, the ones that we see, we don't see any, all right? The very few, Lazarus, Jesus, we don't see them being embalmed in any way, right? And if anyone was going to be embalmed, it would be Jesus, right? Because he was by those that wanted to take care of his body, embalming in certain times in culture was a way of honoring the body. Again, that you could sort of afford, right? It's sort of like going now and buying the nicest casket in the place, right? To prove that you were able to buy the nicest casket in the place. In some places, that's what embalming was. How do we think of this? And again, I'm still thinking through all this myself, right? We can say that unlike cremation, where unquestionably the process is meant to sort of destroy or break down, maybe that'd be a better word, maybe destroy is too negative, but break down the body quickly, right? Cremation or embalming is certainly, as a process, meant to preserve the body, right? Primarily for funerals, primarily for viewings, things like that. So, again, I know some of you met Pastor Brockman, Michael Brockman, that was in Oakley and Hoxie. I mean, he came to, he was really convinced that embalming was, well, I think he would almost say worse than cremation as far as the invasiveness. Cremation's at least like one act and you're done. I don't know if that's accurate, but I want to at least have us think about this, right? Is this the way that we care for the body, right? Is having it be really manipulated so it looks nice when we have a viewing, if we have a viewing, okay?
Well, what if we don't have a viewing? We certainly wouldn't.
Right.
And I'm strange, I know, but I don't like viewings.
Okay, right, yeah. Well, I don't think you're all that strange. I think there's a lot of people that don't like viewings. Yeah,
I just think, and I don't want somebody saying, oh, well, they should have put a different color on her.
Yeah.
Oh, she didn't have her rings on. It's just all that stuff. And, well, I just do away with that.
Yeah. This is one of those differences between men and women. Let me ask, just when we're thinking about if we were having an open casket, men, do you really care what you look like in the casket? Maybe a little? John wants to look nice. No. I never have conversations with women. Women, I have a lot of conversations with. Either I don't want to be seen, right? Yeah. Or I hope they do this or that, or I hope I look like this, and again, that's just men and women.
And sometimes the viewing, seeing that body that way, that's the last time you see him, and that's like ingrained in your memory.
Right.
So, and maybe you don't want to picture them that way. Maybe you want to remember other things about them, and then you just have that mental picture that's hard to get out of your head.
Yeah, and I hear that a lot. The only thing I'd push back on is a little bit, I think it's okay to have that memory in your head, again, because it brings our mortality, right, into that. And also, that doesn't mean if you see them there, you're not going to remember going to the lake with them also, right? But I know, a lot of people do say that. And again, I guess we could talk about open casket versus closed casket here too, right? And all these things.
My mother's side of the family always had a tradition of taking a picture.
A picture, yes.
A picture. That always kind of bothered me.
Yeah, Jamie?
So for my first 4 kids, they had open caskets all the time, just when we were in Ellsworth, and I think they got used to it. so it wasn't gross to them. And we had lots of conversations about it. So I think it was good that they saw the open casket and talked about it a lot.
Yeah, and Ellsworth was almost, I don't know, do we have cremations there? Maybe one or two, but not many. Yeah.
I've read a lot of material on when this day and age, when a soldier comes home that's been badly mutilated.
Right.
They can, amazing what they can do at the mortuary.
Right. Yeah.
Them look.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's really part of the art of what they do there, right? And again, I think we do want to just think through, is that how we should treat the body? Again, like you said, it might bring great comfort, right? And it's meant to preserve the body in a way, right? And I mean, in one way, right, funeral homes almost are trying to make people look alive but sleeping. Would you agree that that's kind of what they're aiming for?
But they always have them sleeping with their glasses on. You have to sleep with your glasses on. Well,
when the resurrection comes, no, you don't. Never mind. Never mind. I always want to know right where my glasses are when I wake up. Yeah, right. No, yeah. So, go ahead. Yeah.
I was reading about the Jewish thing. So modern Jews, like the Hasidic Jews, was like the 24 hours they had to be buried, and they'd just be washed and dressed in some white gown.
Yeah.
So what do Jews do about it now?
I'd have to look that up for sure, but I'm fairly certain that like Orthodox Jews, right, ones that are pretty serious about their religious practice still do that. A very simple dressing and a quick burial. I have to look it up to make sure of that, but I'm pretty certain that's the case. Of course, this is what...
more prevalent now, because I know two people within the last 5 years that they just took their body out and buried them within 24 hours.
Yeah, right. So maybe that moves us into this. Are there other options, right? And these are the Kansas laws, right? You can be buried within 24 hours without any embalming or refrigeration. We'll get to that in a second. But so if you're going to be buried quickly, you can do that without any embalming, and there's no trouble there as far as the laws, and no trouble with the funeral home there or anything like that. What's the downside to this that most people would argue against?
The only trouble is within 24 hours, if you've got family that was with, they don't have a chance to come and say goodbye.
Yeah.
Which to me, that's part of what the funeral is all about.
Right.
Is putting that final cork into this is the end.
Right.
Now we entered a new chapter.
Yeah, right, okay. And again, I think maybe we said this with cremation, but that is another factor that a lot of people list of why it's become so popular, is because it allows, more time to get family together, and family's more spread out. And if I want to be negative about it, family is less concerned about getting back for a funeral, right? You hear a lot of people, I can't go there, I was going to go on a cruise. Sorry, your mom died. You're not going on the cruise. That's my personal opinion. But whatever. Anyone can go on a cruise during a funeral? I feel bad now if you really did that. But yeah.
My parents both donated their bodies to science. So, So my dad is gone, and his body went to KU, and then close to 6 months later, they sent back the ashes.
Okay.
Well, nobody showed up for the funeral.
Yeah.
The memorial service after that.
Yeah. Yeah, and
nobody, but very.
I know. Well, and that is part of the thing too, is I think we do get a lot of people that end up kind of disappointed because they kind of think they're delaying to get more people there. And the more you delay, at least again in my experience, the less people you have there, right? Okay, so you can be buried. The other thing that the law says is you can be refrigerated at under 40 degrees, so go check your refrigerators for space and for temperature. No, I'm joking. Until the day of your burial, right? So to me, and just all these thoughts we've been talking about, I kind of thought, well, let's assume maybe there's somebody here that's listened to all this and they say, well, that kind of sounds the best to me, right? Because then still I can delay a little bit and get my family here, but I don't need to be embalmed, right? And so, but then I got thinking about it, I'm like, is that even offered? Like, you know, it's the law. Yeah.
So you can.
Are you going to offer a freezer?
We rolled in our walk-in cooler at 32 degrees.
Yeah, there you go.
Can we stay there?
Well, this is what I'm saying. I called Jason Ballman, right? Because I wanted to say, you know, what if somebody went through this and said, I kind of think this might be the best option for me. Is that possible? So here's what he told me is, yes, they have refrigeration, so they can do this, certainly. But he said, again, you have to be in there until the day of your burial. The other thing that he said was he would not wait more than 2 weeks, would be his principle to do it. I'm not sure exactly why, but because of why I say I'm not sure exactly why, because his other thing he told me is no open caskets. Even if it's like 2 days later and you've been refrigerated, no open caskets. Why is that?
Well, because you just look like when you thaw the steak.
Yeah.
You know, you would have no.
Right.
Pastor, that could
Yeah.
be when you divide up the body so you can make it so you have room for all the parts in your refrigerator.
Oh, man.
You could put it in.
Who raised her? Yeah, right.
He's one that likes all these gory
Yeah.
books and
If you're going over to their house to eat, make sure what you're eating. And really, I think if we're honest, this comes down to the fact, again, some families might be just fine with an open casket viewing with the person in whatever state they're in, right? I mean, after all, we hope at least that some of them were there when the person died. And my guess is that if you refrigerate someone for a couple days, it just sounds weird even to say sort of, but and you bring them out, that they're going to look fairly similar to what they did when they died, right? I mean, that's the point of refrigeration, is you're not leaving them out to start to decay, right? But my point is, some people might be okay with that, but the funeral home is not. Why? Because they're going to have people show up at that funeral that don't know this is the option that's been taken, and they're going to go, that is the worst funeral home director I've ever seen. If that's what that guy looks like what happened to their cosmetologist and all of those kind of things, right? So for them, it's a business thing as much as anything, as they have to, their business is making people look nice.
Then there's these people that want to be frozen.
Frozen forever, right? Yeah. Did we ever figure out which baseball player? Weren't you saying anything?
Joe DiMaggio.
Joe DiMaggio, okay. Right?
Joe.
Yeah, right. So, yeah. So, yes.
I'm wondering, you have this frozen thing.
You can be a little bit above frozen.
Well,
Just really cold.
the funeral director says there will be no viewing.
Right.
I mean, that's just a law or whatever it was called. Then I think it wouldn't be maybe the shock to the people that work with the people during death, or they were dying.
Right. Well, and I was going to call him back, and I didn't get that done this week, because I was wondering whether they'd still do a family viewing, right? Just, sometimes you come in, beforehand. Yeah.
That's why my uncle was.
Okay.
They called us all in. We come in out of the field and everything, and had a viewing there.
Yeah.
And then he went right to the cemetery.
Okay. So I don't know, maybe they would still do that. And again, again, some of this is a little bit more complicated just to figure out. And I guess this is part of the whole thing. We get all these things we want to accomplish, right, with a funeral in one sense, right? I think it's important to look in the body, or I don't like to, right? All these different things. I want everybody to be able to gather and get back there. And I know it's going to probably take even people that, really are going to make it a priority. It may take them, 3-4 days to get back to where you are. We get all these things, and it ends up kind of becoming very complicated, right? And one of the things I've kind of said in general is, it wasn't too long ago that every funeral was very close to the same, right? Person died, 2 to 3 days later, you had, 2 to 3 days, you have the visitation the night before, then you'd have a funeral the next day, you'd go out to the cemetery, you would have the burial, come back, eat a ham sandwich, and that was it, right? Like that was every tater tot casserole also, but, right, whatever it is, right? But, and I sometimes wonder if nowadays we aren't, even like if you got your newsletter, there's funeral guidelines in there. And I don't think I put this in there, but part of the other thing is like if we have some standards, I actually think it's kind of a service to the family to not have to think through every last thing they could do. Because if you don't know, fights break out nowadays about, and I don't even just mean like with the pastor and the people, that sometimes too, but within families, right? Because, I want to have this person do this, or I want to have this. Oh, no, I don't like them because they did this to me, some time ago, and so I don't want them involved. And so I think to some extent, maybe I'll admit this is kind of a thought about life in general to me is we used to have a lot less choices in life, but I think life was probably a little easier because of it. The fact that everything we do, we think we have to analyze from 42 different directions. I'm not sure that's good for us. Yeah.
I don't know how long they left Bev Beal, but they left her quite a while.
Okay.
And then they had a viewing.
They did. Okay.
And my son said, "Boy, I don't know who put on her makeup."
Yeah, right? And maybe that comment got to Jason, and that's why he doesn't do it anymore. No. Yeah. But I think that's it. And again, I suppose there's always some latitude here of, and some of these laws keep changing too. Who can have the body and things? Is there a possibility Jason can release the body to a family and they can do what they want with it as long as he's not there at the funeral? You know what I'm saying? They can open I don't know. I don't know what all the laws there are regarding all of that now, but.
We'll see. In Lois and my family, it's traditional you get together the night before, and that's when you talk about things.
Yeah, the life things.
Yeah, life things.
Right.
And that's basically family.
Yeah, yeah.
And, after the viewing, so they have a couple hours of that.
Yeah.
And then at the funeral, it's a traditional funeral.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And again, I don't think there's ever, sometimes again, people too, if you're going to do a traditional funeral, they kind of act like, well, then no one's going to speak about the person's life in the whole course of mourning or something. And again, it's just right? No, oftentimes visitations or wakes or whatever you want to call them, there's lots of that there. And often there's lots of that at the meal too, right? That's why in general here, what we've said, and I think that's in the funeral guidelines, right? If somebody wants to speak about somebody, we're going to do it downstairs during the meal when that kind of stuff is going on anyways, right? Someone's coming up saying, "Oh, I remember when we went fishing," right? And, this and this, right? So, yeah. All right. How much time do I have? 2 minutes? Let's read these 2 verses because we haven't done a lot of Bible talk today. So let's read these 2 verses. If someone would read one and then somebody else can read the other quick. 1 Corinthians 6.
Or do you?
Go ahead.
You've got the other one, Brian.
Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you are bought with a price. So glorify God in your body.
I always like to point out with this verse, the context, which I didn't put up here, but the context is actually sexual immorality, right? What you're doing with your body in a sexual context. The only reason I say that is I hear a lot of people using this now to, how do you say, people like to have Christian gym t-shirts, like, God is my strength with this. And they like this verse, right? Because they're like, what God needs for me to do is have six-pack abs, right? That's how I glorify God with my body. Now again, what I sort of joke with that is, but it is proper to generalize this, right? So how you take care of your body is certainly something to do with how you're honoring God. Right? So we don't want to go to the extreme where it's like God, runs his own physical fitness plant, right? But it's not wrong to take this verse and say we should care for our bodies in a health sense too, right? And things like that.
I always took that verse as like with addiction, like with alcoholism and doing drugs and smoking and those kinds of things. But those are things that you shouldn't do if you honor God, to honor your body.
Yeah, and I think all of that fits. Like I said, I always like to point out the original context, right? And maybe I point this out because I think sometimes our culture has forgotten this, right? That doing sexually immoral things is not good for your body, right? It's bad for your body. Spiritually, to be sure, I think somewhat physically also, if you're doing sexually immoral things. But that's another talk for another time. 1 Corinthians 10, Brian, you're up.
All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up.
So these two verses kind of take us back to where we started with this discussion. One is we want to honor God in every way of our lives, right, at all times. And we want to do that with our bodies, right? Because God created bodies, because he's promised he's going to raise them up. And then secondly, we realize there are things that, again, God has not forbidden us from doing explicitly, right? But we want to know is, are they helpful, right? Do they build up? And that comes back to that overall witness, right? And what we then kind of make our decisions. Couple quick things. So if you're doing anything where you say the body doesn't matter, I'm going to tell you, you can't do that for that reason, right? What gives best evidence of our belief in the resurrection of the body? And then I do think, we should think about the traditions of what our brothers and sisters in Christ throughout time have done. As I think I put there, it doesn't bind us. We don't have to do exactly what those that came before us do, but it would be equally as foolish to not consider their example, right? So you don't have to do exactly what they do. This is true all sorts of things, worship,